But if you look at the overall evidence, I think common sense, reason, and logic says it's the actual burial cloth of Jesus.
All I could see was this light coming at me.
The Holy Spirit went, it blew into me.
I have never been the same since then.
That was it. I'm done.
I was born again.
Welcome to the Weird Christian Podcast. I am your host, Samuel Delgado, and this is episode 65. I interviewed Joe Marino about the Shroud of Turin. We talk about the history of the shroud and why he believes it to be the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So, with no further ado, let's get weird. Welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk about the shroud today. Before we get into it, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came to know Christ, and then how your interest began with the Shroud of Turin?
Well, I was born and raised Catholic in St. Louis, Missouri, and went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school. After graduation from high school, I worked for the federal government and was trying to figure out what I was going to do in life. And I guess I became agnostic, but I didn't give up my interest in religion and philosophy. So, but it took a while even to get back to that after all that schooling, which wasn't 8 years. It was like I was tired of academics. Didn't even start college before I thought I need a break from academics. But I did go to 2 years to college and still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I started reading a lot of any religion and philosophy, Christian or non-Christian. And so whenever I would go to a bookstore, I would always go to the religion section first. And in 1977, I went to a bookstore and I saw a paperback there called The Fifth Gospel, and it had a picture of just the face of Jesus, what's on the negative of the film plate. We'll get into the details of that. But the negative on the shroud looks lifelike, unlike normal photography, which is one of its interesting mysteries. And the subtitle was called "Is This the Face of Jesus Christ?" So I thought, well, this looks like interesting reading. So I brought it home. It was a paperback, and I read it in one sitting. And I just found it fascinating. That was the year before the Shroud of Turin research project, which was mainly American scientists who went over to Turin in 1978 to study the shroud. That was the year before that. And even before the Stirp study, which ultimately concluded they didn't know how the image got on the cloth, I was pretty much convinced by the evidence in 1977 that it was probably authentic. So I actually started writing some of the researchers and getting all the books and articles I could get my hands on, which in those days was not very much, because even though the shroud was pretty well known in Europe, and more specifically in probably France and Spain, France and Italy rather, it was not well known in the United States. It became much better known after the Stirp study came out. So I read it, was fascinated, started writing people. I actually started getting, I got some slides from the Holy Shroud Guild in New York. And it was a key element for me to come back to my faith, Christian faith. And eventually in 1980, I joined a Benedictine monastery and put together a slide presentation and started lecturing in the St. Louis area. And then later on, I started going to conferences, meeting the shroud researchers in person. And then over the years, I've written 2 books and about 70 articles, and have kind of just kind of kept up to the minute. It's just been a fascination that has never let go of me. And along the way, I've always felt that basically God has called me to do this work, and I intend to do it the rest of my life.
Oh, that's incredible. Cool. So a couple questions to kind of unpack what you just said. You grew up Roman Catholic. Are you Roman Catholic now as well?
No, I would call myself an unchurched Christian at the moment.
I got you. So what led you to become agnostic?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of Americans, and a lot of teenagers and young adults, they go to a college. I remember, in the 2 years that I went to college from high school, you were exposed to a lot of thoughts and philosophies that you really didn't get in Catholic schooling.
Mm-hmm.
And, you read these different theologians that have all these wild ideas, and some of them seem plausible. I would just say it's sort of like the general milieu of what the United States was like in the early 70s, and just so typical of a lot of young adults that it's part of the maturing process in a way. You just kind of want to throw off a lot of your old habits and whatnot, and I just felt that there wasn't quite enough evidence to warrant my faith.
Yeah.
And the Shroud was actually very integral in bringing me back to it.
Wow. Yeah, that's really neat. Clearly you were seeking answers, and you were, weren't just accepting things at the surface. So it sounds like after you became agnostic, obviously you were still on that journey as you're kind of like obsessing with religion and philosophy. And it's just really neat that the Shroud led you back to faith. I know for a lot of people, it really can have that effect. That's really neat that's your story, and that you've kind of continued research from there. So I'm curious, this is completely hypothetical, but I'm just asking this because this was so integral to your faith. If it came out tomorrow somehow that it was 100% like a hoax or something, what would that do to your faith?
Wow, that's a great question. Because the Shroud isn't strictly necessary for faith, I think I've done enough other study and research now to have faith based on the original stories of the empty tomb and the apostolic community. Because let's face it, I mean, you have to explain why a bunch of ragtag Jewish men went out all over the world and died. A lot of them died for their faith to tell people about Jesus. And you don't die for a lie.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the Shroud helped me get back to mainstream theology and whatnot. And I think my faith is now strong enough that, and since the Shroud's not needed, if it did come out tomorrow to be a fake, I believe I would still be a Christian. But another caveat there is I believe so strongly in the evidence of the Shroud, and I've been studying it over 45 years now, and I've read basically every major piece, whether it's a book or an article or whatever, including translations of foreign languages. I don't think that Shroud can be faked. And that's one of the strongest reasons that I believe it's authentic. And if it's authentic, that points to the truth of the Christian religion to me.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's great. And I think, like I said, for a lot of people, it's integral. I'm glad to hear that I'm glad to hear that this was part of becoming a faith. But I'm also glad to hear you say that you're rooted in the scriptures. This isn't this doesn't have to be like a make or break thing, but clearly it's something that an apologist could use as evidence for the faith. I mean, it's I remember watching Lee Strobel did some documentaries. And I remember when they did a movie over his life, they showed him looking at the shroud. That was actually one of those things, I guess, as he was investigating that was, strong evidence. And I think, the fact that it hasn't been, there's nothing conclusive about it. It has an allure about it, but just looking at the shroud, like you said, that's what actually caught you was the cover of that book.
Yeah, the face.
Just looking at the face. I mean, it's really incredible. When you see the negative, when you see the photo, it's unbelievable. So I think for a lot of people, that just seeing that is convincing in and of itself. But of course, there's a lot that goes into it that we'll try to unpack in our time together today. But for those that maybe aren't familiar, we've been talking about the Shroud of Turin. What is it?
Okay, the shroud is a large linen cloth. It's about 14 and a half feet long by 3.5 feet wide. And it contains the front and back images of what appears to be a crucified man. And the images have all the wounds that the Gospels say happened to Jesus. So in other words, there's a cap of thorns rather than a crown of thorns, and that would be more historically accurate. Christian art has not always portrayed the crucifixion correctly. Okay, so it's got a cap of thorns that would have went all the way over the top of the skull, not just a nice little ringlet type thing. A soldier is not going to take the time to weave a nice little crown,
Sure.
And it's got the severe scourging. It's got the lance wound. The legs are not broken. And in most cases of crucifixion, the legs were broken. And the reason for that was that if you wanted to get the body down off the cross after the death, if you broke the person's legs, they could not push up on them to breathe, because when you're crucified, you're sagging down and you have to push up on your feet to get air. So if your legs are broken, you can no longer push up, and then you would asphyxiate. It's a really, probably the most horrible torture ever devised. And another interesting point about the scourging, there's a severe scourging there and a crucifixion, which is very odd, because scourging could be a light scourging or it could be a scourging for death. But if somebody was supposed to be crucified, you wouldn't severely scourge them because you wanted them to die by crucifixion.
Yeah.
But if you remember from the Gospels, Pilate actually had Jesus severely scourged with the intention of making the people, feel bad for him and let him go. But it didn't work. They still wanted him crucified. So all of the wounds on the shroud match the wounds as described in the Gospels. And we don't have any other, people make the observation, thousands of people were crucified in Israel and that sort of thing. Well, that's true. But we do not have any other burial shrouds, and certainly no burial shrouds with images on it. So the evidence seems to point to a body that somehow disappeared before the decomposition of the body destroyed both the body and the shroud. So it kind of points, I think, to what we would call the resurrection. And I think that's why we have this cloth, I think, as a reminder of that. And it's not surprising to me that the apostles would have kept it. And, of course, people have always disputed the authenticity of it. And but if you look at the overall evidence, I think common sense, reason, and logic says it's the actual burial cloth of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's hard to sit on the fence because of what you said. It clearly matches, what we read about Jesus' body. So the question is it authentic or is it a hoax, a fake made to appear
Right.
in that way, right? Because as you said, yes, there's been crucifixions, but so your take is that the image got onto the cloth because of the resurrection. Now you see that as light emanating off of the body.
Possibly. I've read all the theories. There's radiation, there's light, there's a corona discharge. And I'll have to be perfectly honest. I don't worry that much about which theory is right because I don't think we can ever prove it. A lot of the theories are speculative, and I'm comfortable personally with just saying I think that the image was caused by whatever the resurrection entailed, and we don't know that because you can't take a body into a laboratory and resurrect it.
Yeah,
so it becomes an element of faith, I think.
Sure.
And that kind of points back to, even going back to the original testimony of the apostles. You had an empty tomb, and you had the apostles saying that the tomb was empty, and you had the apostles and disciples saying they saw Jesus. But you know what? That didn't convince everybody back then,
right?
And it doesn't convince everybody right now.
Absolutely.
So I certainly don't expect even a scientifically analyzed object like the shroud to convince somebody that isn't willing to take that extra step.
Yeah.
In other words, it always takes a little bit of faith,
Absolutely,
even with the shroud.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, I think there wouldn't be enough evidence for someone that didn't want to believe. It's clearly an issue of the heart, and we know we need the Holy Spirit within us to come to that faith. So I agree. I was just curious to know if you had a speculation that you kind of favor the most, but they clearly have not been able to replicate it. And as you said, obviously,
Yes.
if it were, we can't test out resurrection, but they've tested out, what other speculations on the other side, as far as like hoax, what other speculations have they tried to say, well, this is how the image got on there?
Oh, of course, painting is the biggest one, but that's the easiest one to disprove because there is no paint on the shroud. There's no paint, stain, dye, pigment. The image is only on the top several thousandths of an inch of the fibers. So like a single fiber is made up of like about 200 microfibrils, and the image is only on the top 1 to 2 microfibrils. Okay. And another important point that confirms that is that they took a picture, they lighted the shroud from behind and took a picture. And from the front, you could see the blood stains on the arms, crossed over. So you could see the blood on each of the arms. You could see the blood stains that come through because the blood stains went on by contact, but you don't see the image. And the reason you don't see the image is because there's nothing physical that caused the image.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
So painting is the easiest one. There's there's a camera obscura, which why would somebody in the Middle Ages go through all that trouble to put a dead corpse? You'd have to do it like 3 days for the front and 3 days for the back. And there's a dry rubbing, there's a bar relief rather. And the STURP team, or at least some individuals, tested all sorts of artistic endeavors, and none of them work properly. You can duplicate some of the characteristics of the shroud, but nobody, and some skeptics will tell you that they've duplicated the shroud, but nobody has duplicated every single characteristic to the point where if you get the physics right, the chemistry's wrong, and vice versa. So I think it is just virtually actually beyond virtually impossible for an artist, especially one in the 15th century, 14th century, to have faked it.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we're looking at it through a modern lens, and we're trying to think how could we fake this if that was something we were to do. So we're sort of imposing that someone who went to fake this knew how to do it and could successfully pull it off, and we're not able to do it even today. So it is a mystery indeed. So there's several paintings. Some of the first paintings we see of Jesus Christ and his face, I can't remember the artist, but there's one that I'm thinking in particular where his eyes look drastically different, and they, juxtapose that with the shroud in that image. I've heard that those paintings were based off of the shroud. Is there any credence to that?
Oh, I think so. I think if you look at art history, especially starting from about the 6th century, there's a famous one called Christ Pantocrator from St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. And that one is a very well-known painting, and it appears to have been based on the shroud. There was a late Dr. Alan Wanger who did a lot of image overlay. So he would get an image of the shroud and overlay it with different paintings and stuff, and also coins, and find points of congruence, which is just a fancy word for similarities. And he always found numerous points of similarity between the shroud and a lot of paintings. Now, let's be realistic. If you put the shroud face over another human face, you're automatically going to get some points of similarity.
Sure, yeah.
But there are a lot of specific ones that where they're unique to the shroud, like there's a blood stain in the form of a 3 on the forehead, and then there's also a crease in the cloth down here, which you see kind of incorporated into paintings and also coins. And to my way of thinking, the shroud did exist in the early centuries. Artists did see it, and they incorporated the features, the characteristics that they saw, even if they weren't sure what it was. So when some of the artists saw a crease in the shroud and kind of incorporated it into the clothing on their painting.
Wow.
And there was a French researcher named Paul Vignon in the early 20th century that found kind of like 15 major points or characteristics that he found on a lot of Byzantine paintings from the 6th through the 12th century. And based on that, he felt, and a lot of researchers feel that those paintings were based on having the shroud in existence in the early centuries.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because now we have modern paintings of Jesus' face, and of course there's different, we have so many different representations of what Jesus might look like. But you look at some of those older ones, and there are similarities, which is kind of matching what you're saying. So it's really interesting, and I certainly, I personally like those paintings. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but I think those, I don't know, appeal to me as far as what he might have looked like. I've heard, you mentioned coins. I've heard that there's coins over the eyes on the shroud. Now, I don't know if that's conclusive or anyway, I just made a point to ask you.
Yeah.
Are there coins over the eyes on the shroud?
That's very contested. I think that's one of the most interesting points. Now, there's points on both sides of the question. But if you look at the people that there's questions of the photographs that people have used, the people that have looked at it. So it was actually three STURP members that originally thought that there might be a coin on the eye. At least one coin. Some people think there's one on each. They wrote an article in 77, the year before they went over, asking the question whether there were coins on the eyes. And a Jesuit priest decided to pursue that a little bit. And he blew up the right eye area of the shroud, and he found or saw what he thought were four Greek letters, UCAI, which was part of the inscription of Tiberius Caesar in Greek. And he found that there was a Pontius Pilate coin that had that inscription, but the problem was that the inscription should have been UKAI. But then he started going around to coin collectors and stuff, and he found originally, I think, like four different Pilate coins, and I think later, the total got up to about seven. Found other Pilate coins with the misspelled C. Okay, so if the coin is not there, this is one of the world's biggest coincidences, because the letters are in the right place over the eye, that if a Pilate coin was placed there, that's where the inscription is. Now, Barry Schwartz, who was the Shroud's documenting photographer, says that the weave is too fine to be able to discern coin inscriptions.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's speaking from a physics point of view, but my counter to that is, well, if you can't explain the whole image in the first place, why do you have to get overly scientific or technical about something within the image? My own personal belief is that God may have left that coin, or did one of his tricks, if you want to call that. Maybe I shouldn't use that word. That kind of demeans God's power. But I think he could have left the inscription to the point where it can be discerned, and that we can figure out that it was a Pontius Pilate coin, which was only minted between 29 and 32. And Jesus was thought to have been crucified in either 30 or 33. Wow. And that would be an more accurate dating than carbon dating or any other dating method you can think of. So I think there could be a Pilate coin on the right eye. Dr. Wenger thought that there was a Julia lepton on the left eye. Now, personally, I think it would be super, super amazing that you had two different coins that are discernible. I mean, I could buy maybe a Pilate coin on the right eye, but I don't put too much stock in the left eye, just out of sheer probabilities. But I wouldn't deny it completely. So there's a lot of people on both sides of the question. There was also a computer expert named Robert Haralick that did some work after Father Philos had done his in the early 80s, and he believed that there was a Pilate coin there. So it's an open question still at this point.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Okay, so why don't you walk us through... let me ask you this. You've written 2 books on it. So can you tell us what those 2 books were about?
Okay, the first one was called Wrapped Up in the Shroud, Chronicle of a Passion. And that basically tells my story with the background of with some of the material I told you about, going to the bookstore and all that, and then entering the monastery, and then some of the research that I did, and then my coming together with my late wife, who originally called me wanting to know more about the shroud. And by that time, I had already been studied the shroud 20 years. She had just started, and she was a brilliant researcher. And we ended up doing research together that we wouldn't have been able to do if we had stayed separately. So we not only believe that I believe that I had a calling with the Shroud from the beginning, we began to believe that together we had a calling when we came together and did research. So my book recounts that. It was first published in 2011. So it covers, my start with the Shroud researcher in 77 through, I think, toward the end of 2011. And then the second book is about the carbon dating of the Shroud. It's called the 1988 C14 Dating of the Shroud, a Stunning Expose. And it really documents, it's more of a reference book, and it's not easy reading. It recounts all the things that went on before, during, and after the carbon dating. And there were a lot of suspicious looking things done by both the church and the three C14 labs that dated the Shroud. And it's 800 pages. And I knew I was going to have additional material. So I reserved a place in my website. I have a overflow page, so to speak, on my website, which I've now transferred that document to academia.edu to make it more accessible, easily accessible. And I have about 80 additional entries there. So there are numerous problems with the C14 dating. There was a lot of politics, egos, agendas. And I concluded, based on the evidence, that people weren't so much interested in finding out the truth about the Shroud than to, preserve and enhance their own reputations.
Wow. Well, I tell you, I mean, it is so unbelievable if you really fathom the reality of this Shroud for them to scientifically come out and date this and verify it for what people expect it to be is that would be a huge leap. So it's no surprise that there would be controversy in regard to the science behind it. And that's very, very interesting. I do want to eventually get into some of the some objections, some questions that I had personally. Like I said, for me, when I look at it, it's there's no way I could explain it away as something else. But certainly there are other controversies around it. But can you give us like a history of it? I mean, obviously, if we have it here today, one of the big questions is how did it get here? Mm-hmm. So do we have like a chronicled, documented history of where it's been, who's touched it?
To a degree. Almost anything I've said about the Shroud or can say about the Shroud is going to be contested by somebody. Sure. But one of the most famous plausible scenarios was written by the English historian Ian Wilson, who lives in Israel now. Australia, excuse me. And he believes that, the cloth obviously started in Jerusalem because that's where Jesus was crucified. And there's a cloth known in history called the image of Edessa. And some references to that image speak only of a face. Some of them, many less of them, speak of a full body image. So it's always kind of tough looking at historical documents because you have to figure out just from those documents with no commentary and video with it and all that sort of thing, if they're talking about a painting of Christ or if it's the original. But the image of Edessa is known, and Wilson believed, and still I think he's changed his theories a little bit, but basically felt that the image of Edessa was folded in fours so that only the face was showing. Now that kind of makes sense if you think of a 14 and a half foot long cloth. If you're going to carry that around or exhibit it to somebody, logistically, that's very hard to manipulate.
Yeah,
it would be easier just to show the facial image, and it would help preserve the cloth better, I think. So it was believed that the image of Edessa was hidden in the city walls, and there was a big flood there around 525, I think, and then it was apparently rediscovered about 544, and then that's the 6th century period where you start to see all the art depictions of Jesus start to look like the shroud. And the image of Edessa was there, and it was eventually brought to Constantinople on August 16th, 944. And when it was there, it was called the Mandylion. And there's a couple interesting documents and descriptions of the now Mandylion when it arrived. The emperor's sons, one of them described it as blurred, and another one said it was a moist secretion without artificial coloring or stain. And if you think about it, those are pretty good descriptions of, if you're looking at the shroud with the naked eye, those are pretty good descriptions. So the Mandylion stayed in Constantinople until 1204, when the Fourth Crusaders sacked Constantinople and apparently or possibly took the shroud and other relics. And there's a little bit of debate on how long it actually stayed there. Some people said it went to Athens, Greek in 1205. Athens, Greece. There's one document that says it was there, but some people question the authenticity of that document, so you get into those sorts of problems. And then the shroud sort of disappears for a while, and that's not surprising because the Pope at the time issued a decree saying that anybody that stole relics from Constantinople in 1204 would be excommunicated. So if you had the shroud, you weren't going to go around parading that because you would have gotten in trouble. All right. So then it pops up around 1355 in a little town called Lorey, France, in the hands of a knight called Geoffrey de Charnay. And he was a descendant of one of the people involved in the supposed taking of the shroud in 1204. So it's possible that it was passed on from his distant relative down to him. Mm-hmm. And then he wanted to exhibit the shroud around 1355, and he did have an exhibition. And then about 30 years later, his son wanted to have another exposition. And his son appealed to the Pope rather than to the bishop of the diocese. And the bishop, who was named Pierre d'Arcis, was very upset that de Charnay II went over his head. So d'Arcis wrote a draft of a letter to the anti-pope Clement VII, because at that time there were two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, France. So since they were in France, he appealed to Clement VII, saying that the bishop said that his predecessor in 1355 had found the artist that had supposedly painted the shroud, which we know isn't true because there's no paint on the shroud. So that's really the big first historical document, the unsent drafted letter from 1389. And there's a question of whether, copies were starting to be made already. And there was one in possibly in Besançon, France, which later became known as the Shroud of Besançon. Some people believe that is what the bishop was referring to with the painted copy. Some believe that the Shroud of Besançon wasn't around that early, so that's widely contested. But we know exactly where the shroud has been at all times since that 1355 date. And the family of Geoffroy de Charny sold it to the Savoy family in 1453. The Savoy family was the ruling house of northern Italy and southern France, and they kept possession of it. And it was in Chambéry for a while. And there was a fire in 1532, and the shroud was almost destroyed, but it was saved. And then in 1578, St. Charles Borromeo was going to cross the Alps to venerate the shroud. They were suffering a plague at the time. And the Savoy family, to keep Cardinal Borromeo from having to cross the Alps, brought it to Turin because they had, property there. So in 1578, it became known as the Shroud of Turin. And so obviously it's silly to kind of have to point this out, but, if you're looking at historical documents before the 16th century, you're not going to find the phrase the Shroud of Turin, because it's going to be called something else, and was called the Shroud of Loret, the Shroud of Chambéry. I recently wrote a paper called Documented References to the Burial Linens of Jesus. I forget the rest of the title, actually, but it's on Academia. But I list all the references to the burial linens, starting with the 2nd century and going all the way through the first half of the 14th century. And obviously not every reference there is going to be the shroud, but it's possible that some of them could be. And the article is about 45 pages. People can find it on my Academia site. And it's interesting. You'll get several different theories in there of where the shroud might have been throughout its history.
Yeah.
I document who I got the source from, books or articles or whatever. And I have links embedded in the article itself. And people could dig into that and look at the various different theories of one which I just gave.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I'll put links in the show description for anyone that wants to go down that rabbit trail. But I want to have a couple questions about what you just chronicled out and laid out for us. Starting with the 1389 incident with the bishop and the undrafted letter. Now, obviously, you mentioned that it's been tested for paint. At the time, that was the supposed hoax. So, what's the prevailing theory as to why that letter was drafted, claiming it to be a hoax? What's your take on that?
Probably two reasons. Number one, he was mad that de Charny II went over his head, so there might have been some anger at that, and bishops are not above trying to get some retribution. And secondly, the church in which he was, the main church that he was the bishop of, had suffered some damages, and he was trying to raise funds for to rebuild the church. And the exhibit that de Charny was going to have would not have benefited the church that he wanted. So he might have been jealous of de Charny having that exhibit in another church besides the one he was trying to rebuild.
Gotcha. So when I was reading about that, I remember reading something about, at the time, they were selling, they were selling some sort of an offer, a chance, a ticket, I don't know, whatever, but they were making money off the shroud, so for the people to touch it or view it or something like that. Is there any credence to that?
Yeah, there's I wouldn't be surprised they might have charged a fee in in 1355 or whatever to get in to see it. Now, just a note, in modern day, there's in the exhibitions they have now, there's never a charge to see the shroud. But when you see letters and accusations like that, they're usually at best exaggerated. So I couldn't tell you specifically of any financial gain that the 1355 exhibition gained. There might be some details in Wilson's 1978 book. He's got about I think four total now, and he's coming out with another major new book this fall, which I'm looking forward to.
Cool. Okay, and so let's fast forward to the fire that this shroud was involved in. I've read that this was miraculous in nature, that the fire was pretty bad. Much was destroyed, that somehow the shroud not being burnt was in some respect miraculous. Do you what's your take on that?
To a degree, I think it was folded, and it was in it was a silver container, and the fire got it so hot that a drop of molten silver, or some molten silver, dropped on the cloth, and of course, since it was folded, went all the way through. Once you open up the cloth, then then it's all over the cloth. Yeah. Full scale. And so you'll see, in fact, the patches that were put on by the nuns in 1534 are the most prominent thing you see when you first see the shroud. You almost see that before you see the image. So it did destroy some of the information on the shoulders, but other than that, the main part of the image was left intact. And I guess you could say it was somewhat miraculous that it was preserved, because the molten silver could have fallen in several places to the point where huge amounts of data would have been destroyed, but at least it was only the shoulders. So I guess miracle is in the eye of the beholder there.
Yeah, exactly. It certainly makes for a good story to say that it's preserved. It's been through a fire. That's really neat. Okay, so going back to, people charging money for this, I've heard that, I don't know where to place this in history, but this is part of just what I remember reading, that there's at points in history where people believed that if they were to touch the shroud, that somehow they would be physically healed, or that they would be, I don't know, granted some sort of miraculous powers or something like that. Now, is that just sort of like grandiose legend that comes with the shroud, or do you buy into that at all?
I know Paul Vignon, in one of his books, I've got an English translation of one of his books. It mentions, he reports a story that the shroud was touched to a dead man and he came back to life. It's not well documented. I kind of put a lot of doubt with that, because I think if it had happened, it would be better documented and mentioned. His is the only book that I've ever seen it in, so I tend to think that's probably a legend. Now, there was a little girl in England named Josie Woolham, who was dying from a disease. I think she was about 8 or 9 years old, and the doctors gave her only a few years to live. And there was a World War II veteran in England named Leonard Cheshire, who used to go around in England with a bus, kind of promoting knowledge about the shroud. And the girl's parents approached him at some point and asked if he could try to get the Italian authorities to let Josie, or have the shroud touched to Josie. And amazingly, the authorities gave them permission for that to happen. So Leonard Cheshire and Josie traveled from England to Turin I think in the late 50s, I believe. And they took the shroud out of its container just for Josie, and they laid it on her lap. Now, she was not instantly cured, but she did surpass the doctor's prediction of how long she would live. And she actually became an adult and got married and went to see the shroud publicly exposed in Turin in 1978. So you might call that a miracle. I definitely, based on the documentation, that certainly is worthy of belief.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. So if you wanted to see the shroud today, how would you be able to do that? Or would you? And have you yourself seen it?
I have seen the shroud twice. It was on public exposition in 1998 and 2000, and I saw it both times there. When you file through, you can't stand there as long as you want. They make the line go through, but you can go in the back of the church and see it from farther away if you want. You can stay as long as you want in the pews. But interestingly enough, another interesting characteristic about the image is that if you're closer than 6 feet or further away than 10 feet, it's harder to see. And I think that's a point against an artistic rendition, because if you're going to hoax something, wouldn't you make it so that everybody could see it from as far away as possible?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense for an artist to do something that can only be seen between 6 and 10 feet.
Yeah, that's wild.
So I'm sorry, I forget the second part of your question.
Like if I wanted to go see it, how would I be able to?
Oh, if you, yes. It's in there had been a separate chapel, and that had a fire, and it was moved to the main part of the cathedral. And the chapel was eventually repaired, but I want to say that they never moved it back to the chapel. I think it might be in the main part of the cathedral. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it's in a special container with bulletproof bulletproof glass and argon and oxygen, a special mixture to keep the image from degrading. So if you could go in the main cathedral, all you would basically see was the container, and it's rolled up, so you wouldn't be able to see the image. So the next public exposition, as of now, is scheduled for 2025. It hasn't been made official. That's only 3 years from now. It was announced, I think, as far back as 2015 that 2025 would be the next date, and I'd be very surprised if it wasn't shown in 2025.
So, I mean, what's the deal with keeping it, not on display?
A lot of it's just logistics. It takes a lot of manpower, and there's the worry of danger of terrorism and stuff. In fact, the shroud was believed to have been set on fire, or tried to be set on fire in 1997 by terrorists. So there's security concerns, and when you have, there's always anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 million people that converge on Turin when it's shown. So that takes a lot of planning and
sure.
Logistics.
Sure, I gotcha. Cool. So I guess my next, this is probably the biggest objection that I had personally. Like I said, I'm pretty convinced just by looking at it, and by the fact that it's not been able to be replicated. But when you read about Jesus' burial in the Gospels, both Luke and John, they write about strips of linen. Now, obviously, the shroud is a sheet, so that's a question mark there. And then also John, further, he writes, I guess, in his account only, he writes about the cloth that's wrapped around Jesus's head, which is
Right.
separate from the linen.
Yeah.
So how do we account for what's in the gospel account and what we know as the Shroud of Turin?
Right. Well, of course, oceans of ink have been spilled on the differences between John and Luke in general, and more specifically on the burial accounts. And you're right. I'm impressed that you knew that Luke uses the word Athonia in his second reference to the shroud, just like John did. Depending on the gospel translation, a lot of the English translations that people use are not really faithful to the original Greek. So a lot of the English translations call Athonia, which is the Greek word that John and Luke both used. They say strips of linen, which automatically makes people think of the Egyptian mummies.
Exactly.
And the Jews did not wrap their corpses like Egyptian mummies. They used shrouds. Okay. And the strips of linen probably refer to, once you put a body in a shroud, you still use strips of linen to bind the wrists and the feet and that sort of thing. So that's probably what the strips of linen are referring to. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they first mention the shroud, use the Greek word sindon, which is basically means shroud. And then, as I mentioned, in Luke's second account, he uses the word Athonia, and you're right, John uses sudarium, which is a face cloth. So when Jesus died on the cross, they probably covered his face with a face cloth, and then they carried the body to the tomb. And then once they got in the tomb and were getting ready to fully wrap it just in the shroud, they would have taken the face cloth off, put it to the side, and then start the burial procedure in just the shroud. So, and the face cloth is believed to be a cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is in a cathedral in Oviedo, Spain, and it's been there since about year 614. And some shroud researchers have examined both the shroud and the sudarium and possible relationship. And the sudarium does not have an image. It does have blood stains on it. It's a much more simple weave than the shroud, which is a 3-to-1 herringbone, which is very expensive. But the sudarium is a more, it's about the size of like a towel, small towel. And it appears that they did wrap the same man. So if the sudarium's authentic,
Yeah.
the shroud would definitely date back to at least 614, and that puts it off 700 years right away from the 1260 to 1390 dates that the labs assigned for the shroud. So there's, I've got several papers on my academia site that look at the Greek words used, the relationship between the synoptics and John. If people go to that site where my papers are, you could spend the rest of your life there, because, as I say, I got about 60 articles, and also the supplement to my book, which kind of can be read. It's a supplement to the book, but it sort of can be read independently as like a mini version or a condensed version of the book as well.
Gotcha. Awesome. So I'll invite you to give us any other, convincing evidence, or, I guess you can wrap up however you want. Those are the questions I had. And of course, you go and plug your website, let people know where they can get your books, and then we'll close out.
All right. Well, my website is homestead.com/New Vistas, Homestead, HOMESTEAD. New Vistas is one word, NEWVISTAS, homestead.com/newvistas. The easiest way to get my books is to go to Amazon and put Joseph G. Marino in the search box, and both of my books will come up. And as far as other evidence, I think just the image, if people really take the time to look at the image characteristics and look at the peer-reviewed papers that Stirp published after their study, they spent 3 years putting together the information. And they had the best equipment and science and technology available at the time. In 1978, they published in like 24 peer-reviewed articles. And that's where you need to start if you want to look at the original data. Most of the knowledge that we have about the shroud is based on the Stirp study of 1978. And I want to point out that the shroud is literally the most intensely studied artifact in human history, not just relic. I'm talking about any relic. In other words, there is no object on the planet that has had more hours put into studying this, bar none.
Wow.
And if you remember or realize that the Stirp team were made up of men and women who worked mainly in the U.S. space and nuclear programs. And so these people helped put men in space, and they helped build nuclear bombs. Now, I think they would have been intelligent enough if they had 5 days around the clock to figure out how that image was made. In fact, that was their only goal, was to find out how the image was made. They didn't go to prove the resurrection. They didn't have, they did a lot of tests, but their main goal was to find out how the image got on there. And they basically failed at that task because they concluded that it was a real human form of a crucified man. There was real blood on it. And they said that until they or another group of scientists did further studies, the answer to how the image got on the cloth remained a mystery. And that's still true today. Nobody knows how that image got on the cloth. And I think if you take Occam's razor, which is, the easiest or the most simplest explanation is usually right, and it also requires the least amount of assumptions. I believe the simplest answer to the shroud is that it is exactly what it purports to be, which is the authentic burial cloth of the historical Jesus of Nazareth.
Sure. Yeah. That's really great evidence right there. I mean, the fact that they haven't, officially able to dispute this, really, and I'm sure there's motivations for many to do that. That in itself is plenty of evidence. But like I said, if you just look at the image, it's unbelievable. It's just incredible.
Yeah, a lot of people do believe, just based on your very reaction, just kind of a gut instinct, that looking at it without even taking into account scientific evidence, that it's real. I look at it from all aspects, and from every angle, it says to me that this thing is real.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on. It's been a fascinating conversation. And if you would close us out in prayer.
Okay. Lord, we thank you for your many gifts to us, including what I believe is your gift of the shroud to mankind, for the doubting Thomases of the 20th and 21st century, and help us to overcome our inclination to be inhumane to others, and help us to be more like you, patient and enduring, and continue to shower us with your many blessings and gifts through Christ our Lord. Amen.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with somebody you know. And with that being said, we'll catch you on the next one.